Easter Sunday, we had services of celebration and joy as we call to mind Christ's triumphant resurrection, and how we call to mind that stone that was rolled away. We sang songs like Thine be the glory, and because He lives I can face tomorrow. In the 40 days that followed Easter Sunday, we have been unpacking the resurrection passages. The passages in the New Testament that deal with what Jesus got up to in that 40-day period between His resurrection and His ascension. So we dealt with doubting Thomas. We spoke about those on the road to Emmaus, and also the recommissioning of Peter, as we find it in John chapter 21. 10 days ago, we commemorated Ascension Day. Also there, I wanted to emphasize the fact that Ascension Day matters, and so we had 2 services. For many of our people can no longer go out at night, so there has to be a morning service. And then for the 2.5 non-pensioners in this church, I also had to have an evening service, otherwise they wouldn't have been able to worship. So it looks like we're going to, for a while, still have to have 2 services every Ascension Day. And now, 10 days on, of course, we reach this climax of Pentecost. So for the last 90 days, we have been on a rather exhausting journey. From the beginning of Lent, the journey to Easter, then Easter itself, and then the unfolding of this walk towards today, where we celebrate the coming of the Holy Spirit, and where we commemorate the birthday of the Christian movement. Many people forget, or perhaps never knew, that Pentecost was not always this celebration. Pentecost in the Old Testament began as a harvest festival. I've asked Jenny to put on the screen the Old Testament festivals, just so that we can know what they are. There are festivals that God ordered in the Torah, things like Passover, Pentecost, Tabernacles, the very holy one, the Day of Atonement, which the Jews still commemorate every September, next to Debbie. The smaller feast of Rosh Hashanah, which is the New Year. Purim. Purim is based on the event of Esther, remember? And Hanukkah, of course, is based on the apocryphal material, the Maccabean Revolt. That event when the temple in 164 BC was rededicated after the Greeks defiled it by slaughtering a pig on the high altar. So that's the collection of Jewish feasts and festivals. Not all of them were pilgrim festivals, however. Which of the above mentioned were the pilgrim festivals? And this is where people normally put up their hands immediately and say that Day of Atonement, because it's so very holy, must have been a pilgrim festival. Believe it or not, it actually wasn't. There were only 3 pilgrim festivals instructed by God in the Old Testament, and I always remember them by the little thing I created by calling them PPT. Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. So there were 3 pilgrim festivals, and then the others like Rosh Hashanah, the ones I've just spoken about. What sets pilgrim festivals apart from the rest of the other festivals, like Purim and Hanukkah, and so on and so forth? We dealt with in the Lenten teachings with this. Have you forgotten? Can I remind you, Lindy? Yes, that is a bit vague. Let me fill in the gaps. If you were a Jewish male, older than 12, living in a 15-mile radius around Jerusalem, you had to be at the temple for the pilgrim festivals. In other words, you had to be there for Passover, for Pentecost, and for Tabernacles. Of course, many people living further away would try and get there as often as possible. Some people only managed to make one trip in their lifetime because it was so darn expensive. And we suspect that Simon of Cyrene, the guy who carried Jesus' cross, was one of them. He had probably saved up for years and years and years to travel from North Africa, where he lived, to be in Jerusalem for one single Passover. Passover was always celebrated in the month of Nisan or April. And then 50 days after the Passover, there was the second pilgrim festival of the year, known as Pentecost. It used to be called the Festival of the First Fruits. And when I speak about Old Testament things, I call it that, because in our Christian context, when I say the word Pentecost, we immediately go to the Holy Spirit and His coming on those early believers. The word penti is Greek for 5, and pentikonte would be Greek for 50. So that's where the word comes from. Pentecost is 50 days after Passover. But in our case, 50 days after our Easter. Tabernacles is later in the year. It happens in October. It's also known as the Feast of the Booths, because some Orthodox Jews would actually go and live in some booth in a desert, because the Tabernacles is a celebration of the wilderness wanderings, when they were nomads living in the desert for more or less 40 years. So does everybody now, after this significant history lesson, understand where we're at? We call it Pentecost, but the Jews now would find themselves at the time of the harvest of the first fruits. The fact that Jerusalem was so packed at Passover was because it was the pilgrim feast. The fact that Jerusalem was so packed during Pentecost because it was a pilgrim feast. I don't think that everybody in the city expected that that would be the moment where the Holy Spirit descended. People were there because it was time for the harvest. I'm going to read to us from Acts chapter 2, where the heading, of course, is the Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost. When the day of Pentecost, one can also insert their first fruits. When the day of first fruits came, they were all together in one place. So this is now 10 days after the ascension, right? Suddenly, a sound like a blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire. I think that was probably the closest description that the believers could come up with. Because how does one explain a touch of the Spirit? I've always thought it's quite a strange term to use, tongues of fire, you know. Interestingly, the hats that a bishop wears in the Anglican and Roman Catholic churches would be called a mitre. And you will know that it's quite pointy. And that's not just for it to look fancy, it's supposed to represent the Pentecostal flame, actually. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit, all 120 of them, and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now they were staying in Jerusalem, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard the sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard them speaking in his own language. That was going to be one of my 3 points today, which we are now storing for next week. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Are not all these men who are speaking Galileans?" In other words, northerners. Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians and Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing these funny names correctly, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya, Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans from the island in the Mediterranean, and even Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonder of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they asked one another, what does this mean? Some, however, made fun of them and said, they have had too much wine. What follows from verse 14 on is Peter jumping up, being his forward self and preaching the first Christian sermon ever recorded, with great results that followed. I quickly have to tweak what I have prepared because I myself am now very hungry. If you promise to come next week, then I'll keep this short. Okay? Promise? I've heard that before. Nervous laughter doesn't quite do it for me. As I prepared for this morning, I realized that what happened at Pentecost was significant and vital in the extreme. For those Christians of the early times would not have been able to live for Jesus, to witness for him, to serve him, and to follow in his teachings unless the Holy Spirit anointed them from on high. And that's going to be the one and the only point for today. The life of a Christian is not possible without the enabling of the Holy Spirit. It is the Holy Spirit who empowers us to live for Jesus. It is the Holy Spirit who empowers us to pray in a way that we should. And it is the Holy Spirit who empowers us to build powerful and effective ministries. One of the scriptures I stumbled across in getting ready for today was actually 1 Corinthians 3 verse 4, where Paul says, unless he preaches with the blessing of the Holy Spirit, unless he preaches without the blessing of the Holy Spirit, he's wasting his time. And I just really responded to that verse. My heart awakened to it afresh. For I just realized again that if I ever come here without the Holy Spirit resting on me, we are wasting our time. Another thing that hit me from this passage is that all of them were filled with the Spirit. The Holy Spirit didn't pick and choose who he was going to bless and on whom he was going to descend in the form of tongues of fire. He just wanted to work in every life which was willing and ready for it. In Acts chapter 4, when the disciples, by now known as the apostles, when they got into serious trouble for having healed the lame man sitting at the temple gate, remember the authorities called them in and said, we want to speak to you guys. You are announcing Jesus' name. We don't like Jesus' name. In fact, we hate him. That is why we killed him. And now you are perpetuating this trouble that he caused. And so I think it says there that the chief priests were there, Annas or Caiaphas or one of those big shots, and the teachers of the law were also present, and they wanted to now interrogate Peter and John for having healed this lame man sitting at the temple gate. Eventually they didn't know what to do with the apostles, and so they let them go. But the minute Peter and John got to the others, the rest of the 120 of them, they immediately started praying. And it says there that as they prayed, all of them were filled with the Holy Spirit. Another bit of proof that the Holy Spirit is no respecter of persons. That anybody who would be open to His ministry, He would bless and change and transform and anoint. And so I want to hold out to you only that one thought for this morning. This thought of the Holy Spirit wanting to today bless everybody who wants it in this place. In Acts chapter 8, so the book of Acts has often been referred to as not the Acts of the Apostles, but the Acts of the Holy Spirit. For as one reads it, it becomes evidently clear that the Holy Spirit is the main figure in the book. It's the Holy Spirit who constantly acts, who constantly does things, who constantly makes people whole, who constantly gives people strength and wisdom and courage to do the work of God. In Acts chapter 8, Peter and John hear that the gospel had reached Samaria. So you need to remember that Samaria was enemy territory. That is why Jesus having a conversation with the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4 is so utterly controversial. Jesus never had time for these man-made boundaries to begin with. Peter and John very excitedly heard that the gospel had now reached even Samaria, where the people they don't like were living. So they rush to Samaria, and what's the first thing that they do as they get chatting to the Samaritans? They lay hands on them, and then the report comes. You can check it out in Acts chapter 8 if you need to. The Holy Spirit comes on those Samaritans. Not even being a Samaritan excluded them from this beautiful thing that the Holy Spirit wanted to do. They were willing, and He was ready. And so today, without sounding like one of these television, what are they called, televangelists, I want to extend an invitation. Perhaps you are longing for something, or should I say for someone in your life. Maybe you are really yearning for a fresh touch of the Holy Spirit. Maybe there's some healing that's lacking in your life. Maybe you are aching for comfort. Maybe your life is in a place of sadness or struggle. I want you to now, as we sing that song again, we're not going to make a big hoo-ha about it. It's just going to be very tender. Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. This has got nothing to do with me, so by the way, I'm the one who facilitates the service. That's about it. This is between you and the Lord who has redeemed you. Between you and the Lord who wants to set you free from whatever is holding you back. So today, on this extraordinary Sunday, known as Pentecost, I'm going to ask you to remain seated and perhaps just sit like this with your hands on your lap, if you want to. I always think, when we express ourselves, it helps us. God can bless us whether our hands are outstretched or not. But perhaps we just need a reminder that this is how one receives. And so I'm going to start playing this song, and we're going to sing it softly. And you're going to bring your private prayers to the Holy Spirit, the one who brings life to the church.